the author decided to share the entire content of the book, the sequel to Book 2. With voice by Ava from Clipchamp, wealthier cultivators, seeking faster advancements, opted for high-grade alternatives rich in spiritual energy and supplemented their diets with diverse ingredients to avoid monotony. Eating remained relevant only during the early stages of cultivation, up to the foundation establishment. Once cultivators reached the mid-foundation level, they could transition to consuming a pill called fasting pill, bigu, which allowed them to sustain themselves for an entire month without food or drink. The time saved by taking fasting pill was often invested in practicing techniques, refining tools, or crafting talismans and pills to accelerate cultivation. However, even at advanced levels, many families and sects maintain the habit of traditional meals. For them, eating wasn't about sustenance, but rather a daily pleasure. Among these were two distinct groups: those with exceptionally high cultivation, disinterested in endless pursuit of longevity, who found constant training dull and sought simple joys like eating. People with low cultivation, standing still, think that they're just like that, living for so many years is enough, choosing to focus on living contentedly rather than striving for unrealistic goals. For the long-lived cultivators, boredom often set in after centuries of life. Having experienced nearly everything the world had to offer, even the most remarkable phenomena became mundane. For these individuals, eating became a means to pass the time and escape the monotony of eternal life. After living for over 1,000 years, even the endless pursuit of cultivation lost its allure, yearning. Living for hundreds of years or thousands years cultivating day by day, it has become so boring that they don't want to cultivate anymore. When the spiritual grain and meat were cooked, Ye Jun brought 2 bowls to the table and called little Junso, who was playing on the bamboo bed, to come eat. The two sat together, sharing their meal as Ye Jun chatted about random things. Afterward, Ye Jun encouraged Junso to brush his teeth, reminding him to clean up before going back to play. Junso nodded obediently and followed her instructions. Together, they brushed their teeth before returning to their respective activities. Junso resumed playing while Ye Jun continued her cultivation, occasionally practicing with her spear. The winter months, being relatively uneventful, allowed both to dedicate time to their pursuits. While Ye Jun trained, Junso alternated between playing and practicing writing characters. Junso was exceptionally bright, quickly grasping everything Ye Jun taught him. Ye Jun wasn't too surprised, knowing that in the world of cultivation, children often developed rapidly. It was simply the norm. On December 24th, Ye Jun decided to take Junso out for a walk. By then, the harshness of winter had eased slightly, and the weather was milder. For Ye Jun, a cultivator, the biting cold was of little concern. However, her son, still a mortal, lacked the physical resilience she had. Despite bundling him in warm clothes, Ye Jun used her spiritual energy to form a protective barrier around Junso's small body. This technique was something she had devised on her own. Although she had learned basic methods for enhancing spiritual plant, extending her spiritual energy to envelop another person was new territory. It required a great deal of effort and consumed her energy rapidly. Even so, Ye Jun managed to maintain the barrier as they strolled for about half an hour, the limit of her endurance. Though Junso was well insulated in his warm attire, Ye Jun was cautious about the winter chill, fearing it might harm her child. Her thoughts were clear. Better to be over-prepared and avoid trouble later. Chapter 20. The peaceful days of winter slipped by without much incident. Near the secret teleportation gate of the Ha clan, a group of rogue cultivators infiltrated deeper into the clan's organization after replacing several key members. Their plan to seize control of the entire Ha family was progressing steadily. Meanwhile, the scattered rogue cultivators living near the Ha clan remained oblivious to the brewing storm. They went about their lives, focused on their daily routines, unaware of the problem. Returning to our protagonist, Ye Jun, as the last remnants of snow and ice melted, she prepared for a new season of farm and growth. Now 18 years old, Ye Jun had reached the 5th level of qi refinement despite her mediocre spiritual roots. For someone with inferior spiritual roots, her progress was remarkable. By utilizing condensing qi pills, she could have cultivated even faster, potentially matching the speed of those with superior spiritual roots. Yet Ye Jun chose not to rely on such aids. She believed that for someone with her natural limitations, achieving the 5th level at her age was already an impressive feat. If other rogue cultivators knew of her progress, they would likely be astonished. This perspective was, however, a reflection of Ye Jun's innocent and pure mindset. For those with superior spiritual roots, the goal was always to advance as quickly as possible. Their ambitions were fueled by their exposure to sects or powerful clans, where access to advanced knowledge and resources expanded their horizons. These cultivators were motivated by the allure of powerful artifacts, pills, that required higher cultivation levels to craft, wield, or activate. For cultivators with broader knowledge, progression wasn't merely a desire, it was a necessity. Many rogue cultivators, like Ye Jun, struggled to overcome even the 1st level of qi refinement in their lifetimes. For these individuals, their modest spiritual roots, limited resources, and lack of understanding left them with few options. They often settled for a peaceful life, content to live out their years to the age of 200 before passing away in quiet satisfaction. Ye Jun once shared this common mindset, content to live as many rogue cultivators did. However, a problem of life-altering event awakened the memories of 2 past lives within her, including knowledge from Earth. This unique hack from system gave her a fresh perspective and opportunities beyond the reach of most low-level cultivators. For the majority of rogue cultivators in her position, opportunities often came with great risk, venturing into dangerous secret realms in search of fortune, only to lose their lives in the process. Those who dared to defy their fates sought wealth or opportunity. They went in search of fate and then died. They died at a very young age. If they had just worked and lived peacefully like that, they could have lived to be 200 years old and died of old age in satisfaction. They also, just a few who had restless thoughts, wanted to escape fate. Others chose a safer, quieter path, living out their lives in simple contentment, avoiding unnecessary risks. For Ye Jun, the convergence of her unique circumstances set her apart from the ordinary rogue cultivator, granting her a chance to rewrite her destiny. Rumors spread among rogue cultivators about those who, upon exploring secret realms, found fortuitous opportunities that transformed their lives. These tales of striking riches, or altering one's foundational aptitude, captivated many. They ignited a longing in rogue cultivators to change their destiny, inspired by the dream of being the fortunate few who could overturn their fate. While it was true that low-tier secret realms occasionally yielded high-grade spiritual plants capable of altering a cultivator's aptitude, such events were exceedingly rare. Most secret realms contained only basic spiritual herbs, common minerals, or low artifacts. For the few who did manage to acquire rare treasures like high-grade spiritual plants, holding on to them was a different matter altogether. Such cultivators were often targeted, robbed, or even killed by stronger individuals coveting their fortune. Ye Jun tilled the land, spread fertilizer, and watered her spiritual field. Once spring had fully settled, she began planting the first crop of the year. With precision, she sowed seeds and young spiritual herbs and vines. She infused them with spiritual energy and watered them carefully, ensuring their growth. After tending to her fields, she returned to practicing spear technique. Inside the house, little Jun so sat diligently on a chair, practicing writing. He had already mastered the Korean alphabet and could write the names of various household items. Both of them worked hard, living the vibrant and fulfilling days of their lives. Ye Jun's spear training had reached a level where the techniques became second nature, yet she continued to practice daily. To her, spear practice was akin to a sport, a way to keep her body active, even though cultivators didn't need physical exercise like ordinary mortals. The busiest part of Ye Jun's day was spent caring for her spiritual fields, which had now grown to include 2 plots. Growing high-grade spiritual herbs required meticulous care, frequent infusions of spiritual energy, and diligent monitoring. Only with proper attention could these plants thrive, mature flawlessly, and fetch high prices. Ye Jun didn't take her work lightly. She knew these spiritual herbs were more than just a source of income. They were opportunities. If she nurtured them to perfection, the system could reward her with advanced treasures or significant wealth. While she never understood how the system calculated the value of low-quality spiritual herbs, she instinctively avoided letting her crops fall below standard. After all, if sect markets paid little for subpar herbs, her system likely wouldn't offer much either. Her days followed a steady routine, tending to the spiritual fields, teaching Jun so to write, practicing spear technique, cooking meals, and cultivating her spiritual energy. Each day was busy yet fulfilling, as time flowed slowly and peacefully in their corner of the world. Chapter 21. In a remote corner of the Ha clan's territory, chaos erupted after a sudden ambush by a group of dark cultivators. The clan head of the Ha clan was captured, and the once proud family was now entirely overrun by these malicious infiltrators. Disguised as members of the Ha clan, the dark cultivators swiftly took control. The next thing is to swallow the more clans that are dependent on this Hajia clan in the neighboring areas. Once the nearby families were subdued, the captives were transported to the western continent via a teleportation gate, where they faced a grim fate, being refined into pills. In a matter of days, every family under the Ha clan's dependent was captured and replaced, leaving no trace of resistance. The operation was executed so quietly that even the rogue cultivators in the area remained oblivious. These rogue cultivators, weak in power and spiritual roots, were deemed unworthy of immediate action and would be the group targeted last. With the Ha clan's territory fully secured, the dark cultivators turned their sights on the neighboring Tan Van sect. The Tan Van sect, a third-grade sect, held significantly more power than the Ha clan. As a result, the dark cultivators approached with greater caution. Their investigations revealed that the sect once hired an old man who had disappeared after failed the tribulation. The dark cultivators hesitated, wary of the possibility that this powerful individual might still be hid in the sect. A direct confrontation risked alarming other, stronger sects in the northern regions. Carefully crafting their plan, the dark cultivators assumed the identities of high-ranking members of the Ha clan and infiltrated the Tan Van sect. Their strategy mirrored the one used against the Ha clan: infiltrate, replace inside the sect. Meanwhile, the captives were herded into the teleportation gate. Energy locked, they were rendered as powerless as mortals. Lacking the strength to resist or self-detonate, they could do nothing but march in resigned silence through the gate, group by group. On the other side, within the western continent, the prisoners were promptly sent to alchemy facilities controlled by the dark cultivators. Here, their lives will become materials for pills, a horrifying fate that showcased the utter cruelty of the so-called demon cultivators. No one was spared, not even the youngest children. All the captives were processed systematically. For the captives, resistance was futile. Swallowing bitterness, they accepted their fate. Some of the higher-ups had lived for many years. Now they would have to die, becoming the elixirs of the demonic cultivators. In their minds, they had lived long enough. At this age, death was already a satisfaction, but their children were still very young. They felt heartbroken for their children, but there was nothing they could do. Group after group of people entered the alchemy area. Their clothes were torn to shreds, and one by one they were pushed down, falling into the huge, blazing hot furnace. They struggled in the burning pain, but could not speak. Their cultivation and voices were sealed. They just struggled, They looked at each other and slowly turned into spirit liquid with herbs. Each furnace of pills was completed. They were put into porcelain bottles and then placed in wooden boxes. Just like that, one group after another took turns being refined. Returning to the main character, Ye Jun. After days of meticulous care, the spiritual plants had fully matured. Ye Jun harvested all of them, yielding nearly 60 kilograms of spiritual grain. She set aside 10 kilograms to sell to the system. Placing the 10-kilogram bag of grain into the system, she pressed the glowing sell button. Within seconds, the system re-backed the rewards. This time, Ye Jun received a small halo cultivation aura. She touched it and absorbed it, feeling a surge of spiritual energy flow into her dantian. She absorbed 1 year of cultivation. Additionally, the system rewarded her with a medium-grade spiritual stone. Delighted, Ye Jun inspected the stone. She knew the market price of spiritual grain is cheap. Receiving a medium-grade stone from the system was a significant profit. Ye Jun danced around in excitement. Inside the house, little Jun-so looked out at Ye Jun dancing at the spiritual fields. Amused, the child mimicked Ye Jun's movements before returning to their studies. Despite their young age, Jun-so was learning incredibly quickly. They had already mastered the Korean language and were now studying the language of the cultivation world. After a while, Ye Jun placed a large quantity of white sofware japonica and spiritual vines onto the system's tray and pressed the sell button again. Items poured out. Among them was a small porcelain bottle. As usual, Ye Jun opened it to inspect the contents. Inside was a dark brown pill emanating an uplifting, almost ethereal fragrance. She checked the label on the bottle and gasped, "Foundation Establishment Pill." Ye Jun froze in shock, staring at the label. She was well aware of what a foundation establishment pill meant. For rogue cultivators, this pill was a treasure beyond reach. Without it, breaking through the bottleneck at the peak of chi refining could take an indefinite amount of time. The pill was the dream of countless rogue cultivators who had reached the 10th level of chi refining and were nearing the end of their lifespan. Despite years of saving, they could rarely afford such a treasure. Many died with the bitter regret of never attaining a foundation establishment pill, their last thoughts often lamenting the lack of this one opportunity to extend their life by another 200 years. Ye Jun trembled, realizing the magnitude of her fortune. Although she was only at the 5th level of chi refining and unable to use the pill yet, she carefully stored it in her spatial storage pouch for future use. Turning her attention back to the rewards, she collected all the spiritual stones and meticulously inspected the remaining items. This time, the system had also re-backed for her. 3 water talismans, 2 invisibility talismans, 1 earth escape talisman, a 500-gram mineral stone. Ye Jun stowed everything into her spatial pouch. While the system had been generous, she noticed it did not grant her any additional halo cultivation auras. She surmised that spiritual grain had a higher probability of yielding holy cultivation auras compared to the white sofware japonica and spiritual vines. The remaining herbs were sealed in wooden box for later sale at the herbal market. With the medium-grade spiritual stone in her possession, Ye Jun considered herself wealthy by rogue cultivator standards. She decided against selling any more resources for the meager gains of low-grade stones. After clearing the spiritual field, Ye Jun prepared fertilizer and tilled the soil, carefully nourishing it with water. Using her water control technique to nourish the fields, she returned to the house to find little Jun so engrossed in studying. Smiling, Ye Jun headed to the kitchen to cook porridge with spiritual grain and a bit of rat meat. Once the porridge was ready, she served 2 bowls and called Jun-so to eat. As they ate, Ye Jun casually chatted and shared stories about her previous life, revealing the secrets of her origins. She warned Jun-so, "This is a family secret. If it ever gets out, we could be in grave danger." Little Jun-so, puzzled by the concept of danger, innocently asked, "What does danger really mean, Dad?" Ye Jun responded, "Look at this bowl of porridge. The pieces of rat meat are like us. Danger is like someone eating this meat. If our secret gets out, our family might end up like the meat in this porridge." Horrified by the imagery, Jun so promised, "I'll never tell anyone anything about our family. It's too scary." Laughing nervously, the child finished their bowl. After brushing their teeth, Jun So returned to their studies while Ye Jun sat on her bed to meditate. Despite reaching the 5th level of Qi refining, she knew that advancing further required absorbing even more spiritual energy. With her inferior spiritual roots, progress was slow and arduous. Without the system's hack, she would likely still be stuck at the 2nd level of Qi refining. Chapter 22. Back to Ye Jun, the main character. After completing all her farm work, she initially planned to visit the herbal market, but changed her mind after chatting with her child. She decided to go the next day instead. The next morning, Ye Jun said to Jun So, "Let's go to the herbal market." The little one nodded, and the two left their home and headed toward the market. After walking for some time, they arrived. Ye Jun greeted the shopkeeper and took out a box containing spiritual herbs. This time, she decided not to sell spiritual grain to the general store but instead sell her herbs to the herbal market. The Tanban sect had a note recording system. Anytime a spiritual cultivator sold their goods to a market affiliated with the sect, the transaction would be logged, similar to a ledger in the modern world. As usual, Ye Jun sold her herbs to the market, received spiritual stones, and purchased another bag of spiritual grain seeds. This time, she also asked the shopkeeper to recommend some new types of spiritual herbs. The shopkeeper happily introduced 1 or 2 other types of herbs. He didn't ask about Ye Jun's cultivation level, as it was obvious she was a low-level rogue cultivator. There wasn't much need to inquire further. The 2 new spiritual herbs required an 8-month of care and were of a higher grade than white sofware japonica and spiritual vine. They cost 25 low-grade spiritual stones per seed, and nurturing them would consume 40 points of spiritual energy each time. Due to these requirements, very few rogue cultivators were willing to grow such herbs. Their spiritual energy was weak, and cultivating these demanding herbs wasn't feasible for most. The shopkeeper, being honest, only introduced these 2 types, considering them relatively low-grade. He refrained from mentioning higher-grade seeds, knowing Ye Jun likely couldn't care them. Hearing about the 8-month cultivation period, Ye Jun realized that since it was already past the 1st quarter of the year, only 2 quarters remained for planting. These new seeds would take too long to grow. After some thought, Ye Jun purchased 20 more white sofware japonica and spiritual vine plants and 2 seeds of the new type to experiment with the following year. After completing her transactions, Ye Jun led Jun So to a general store to buy some household items before the 2 returned home. Once back, little Jun So rushed inside to pour a glass of water and asked, "Dad, do you want some water?" Ye Jun waved her hand to decline and headed straight to the 2 spiritual fields. Using her earth control technique, she created holes and placed the seeds inside. Then, she used her water control technique to water both fields thoroughly. Once finished, she went into the kitchen to prepare dinner. After drinking his water, Jun So returned to his studies. The little one was nearly 3 years old, with less than a quarter of a year left before his birthday. At 3 years old, children could test spiritual root testing and begin their cultivation journey. However, due to their young age, spiritual roots were harder to detect, making the process more costly than testing at age 5. Families with sufficient resources could bring their 3-year-olds to specialized testing centers for spiritual root examination. While the sects offered free testing, it was only during specific times of the year. Outside those periods, such testing was unavailable. Because of this, spiritual root testing centers outside the official free periods had an opportunity to generate income. The younger the child, the higher the cost, as these services catered primarily to wealthy families. Not many rogue cultivators brought their children to these centers, as their incomes were relatively low. Spending such sums on spiritual root testing seemed unnecessary to them, given the widely accepted belief that children born to parents with low spiritual roots were unlikely to be any different. During the year, the sects held free spiritual root testing festivals, which most families relied on for their children's evaluations. Annually, the Tan Van sect organized large-scale spiritual root tests, mainly to recruit new disciples to help share the workload. These selections extended from the cultivation world to the mortal world. If someone was fortunate enough, they could be taken in by the sect. The mortal world, unlike the cultivation realm, experienced a change in dynasties every few centuries. However, spiritual root testing events remained unaffected. No matter how the dynasties shifted, they never dared neglect these grand gatherings organized by the cultivation sections. The mortal world feared offending these lofty powers. A single flick of a cultivator's finger could reduce a mortal to dust, a terrifying prospect indeed. Each time the gates of the cultivation sects opened, a wave of spiritual energy would spill into the mortal world, nourishing it. Those living closer to these gates enjoyed an abundance of spiritual energy, leading to better health and increased lifespans, sometimes up to 150 years. Because of this, cities near the sect gates became bustling hubs. Even royal palaces were strategically positioned near these areas to reap the benefits of the spiritual energy. Despite changes in dynasties, the location of the royal palace remained unchanged, standing ready to host the test roots events. Among the royal family and nobility, a few were fortunate enough to possess spiritual roots, becoming rogue cultivators. Some were even luckier, having mid-grade or higher spiritual roots, earning them places as outer disciples in the sects. However, even with such honors, they could do little to aid their families. The divide between the mortal and cultivation worlds was absolute. If fortunate, those participating in the grand events might gain permission to briefly visit their families. Some, however, discovered that their families had already perished, leaving them powerless to act. The laws of the cultivation world forbade intervention without the sect's approval, ensuring that no cultivator could arbitrarily interfere in mortal affairs.
They can only sigh for their family.
Chapter 23. Ye Jun called out to little Jun So. Do you want to go out with me? Jun So replied, I really want to, but I haven't finished my lessons yet, so I'll stay home. You can go ahead, Dad. Closing the door behind her, Ye Jun headed straight to the general store to inquire about a technique for concealing her aura. At the store, she greeted the shopkeeper, who recognized her and asked, What talismans are you planning to sell this time? How many do you have? Ye Jun shook her head and replied, This time, I'm not here to sell talismans. Instead, I'd like to ask about a technique for hide my aura. Understanding her intent, the shopkeeper introduced her to the lowest level aura hide technique available. This is the Qi concealment technique, level 1, suitable for those below the early stage of foundation establishment, he explained briefly, knowing that most rogue cultivators rarely reach the foundation establishment stage. Then he quoted the price. The Qi concealment technique costs 4 mid-grade spirit stones, the shopkeeper said. Hearing the price, Ye Jun felt her head spin. She stammered. What? That expensive? For mid-grade stones? She couldn't believe her ears. While she had expected it to be costly, she hadn't imagined it would be so exorbitant, especially for a basic technique. The shopkeeper merely chuckled without saying much. With a grim face, Ye Jun bade him farewell, promising to come back later. The shopkeeper understood her predicament. Even for a rogue cultivator skilled in crafting talismans, it would take a long time to save up enough to afford it. Seeing that she was still young, he assumed she hadn't had much time to accumulate wealth and return to his usual tasks. At the moment, Ye Jun had only 1 mid-grade spirit stone and several hundred low-grade ones. She had thought her savings would be enough, but was shocked at how far short she fell. She wandered over to the rogue cultivators market, where she bought some rat meat and rabbit meat before heading home. Back at home, Ye Jun sat on a chair and recounted the price of the qi concealment technique to little Jun So. Though only nearly 3 years old, Jun So already understood the monetary system of the cultivation world. 4 mid-grade spirit stones could buy a substantial amount of meat or spiritual grains. He didn't say anything further, only nodding his small head in understanding. After her story, Ye Jun went into the kitchen, prepared a meal, and served it. The two of them ate together. Once they finished eating, each went about their tasks. Ye Jun sat on her bed, resuming her meditation to absorb the spiritual energy of heaven and earth. Despite her efforts, she remained stuck at the 5th level of qi refining. The spiritual grains she sold earlier had only provided a meager amount of holy cultivation progress, leaving her struggling to make even the slightest advancement. The next morning, Ye Jun headed out to the fields to tend to her precious spiritual plants. Near her residence, hundreds of demonic cultivators had started arriving. They began renting small houses for 6-month periods. During these 6 months, they planned to set up teleportation gates and gather information about the outer disciples of the Tan Van sect. Their approach mirrored the tactics they had used in the Hawklands region. The dark group infiltrated every nook and cranny of the market districts, registering for various occupations to avoid raising suspicion among the locals. Back to Ye Jun's routine life, she meticulously cared for her spiritual fields daily. Once her tasks were complete, she devoted time to teaching her child, Jun So, about life lessons and proper conduct. She emphasized that they living in a cultivation world where the strong preyed on the weak. Though their current home was peaceful, she constantly reminded her child to stay vigilant against unexpected dangers. Jun So listened attentively, absorbing everything Ye Jun taught. After finishing the lesson, Ye Jun returned to her bamboo bed and meditated to absorb spiritual energy. Nearby, little Jun So practiced writing. He was busy composing a descriptive essay about the spiritual plants growing in their family garden, completely engrossed in his work. As evening approached, Ye Jun opened her eyes and ended her cultivation session. She stood up from her bamboo bed and headed to the kitchen, where she started a fire to cook spiritual porridge with a bit of rabbit meat. Half an hour later, the meal was ready. Ye Jun brought 2 bowls of porridge to the table. The aroma of the meat filled the room. Jun So stopped playing, went to the kitchen to wash his hands, and then sat down at the table to eat. The two shared a joyful dinner. After the meal, Jun So handed Ye Jun his essay about the garden. Ye Jun read it carefully and noticed some spelling mistakes. Using a charcoal pen, she corrected the errors. Then, she patiently explained the mistakes to Jun So, encouraging him to remember and avoid them in the future. Jun So nodded earnestly, taking the feedback to heart. Afterward, both brushed their teeth. By then, night had fully set in, and the two climbed into bed early. Though Ye Jun's financial situation had improved, allowing her to afford candles to light up the room, she chose not to buy them, determined to save as much as possible. In her third life, poverty had ingrained in Ye Jun a frugal mindset. Currently, she could be considered relatively wealthy among rogue cultivators. Around her area, many rogue cultivators, even after years of saving, wouldn't have amassed more than 500 low-grade spirit stones. Moreover, pest infestations were a constant threat to spiritual crops. Through years of cultivation, Ye Jun had learned to predict the pest cycles, making her and many others remain cautious. For several consecutive years, no pest outbreaks had occurred, leading many to speculate that this year could bring an attack. Rogue cultivators with some savings would often rent protective arrays for their spiritual fields. Those affiliated with market districts run by Tan Van sect will for rent these arrays for 2 low-grade spirit stones per month. However, independent cultivators had to pay 8 low-grade spirit stones per month for the same service. For years, there had been no sign of pests damaging spiritual crops, but this year, everyone was worried and took extra precautions. Ye Jun also feared an infestation, so, like many other spiritual farm cultivators, she registered to rent a defensive array for her 2 spiritual fields. She rented the array for 4 months and paid the spirit stones before returning home. As she walked by her garden, she glanced at the thriving, vibrant spiritual herbs and felt a sense of relief and security. Inside the house, little Jun was sound asleep on the bed. Ye Jun approached him, then sat on the bed beside him. Closing her eyes, she began meditating, absorbing the spiritual energy of heaven and earth. The next day, a member of the array installation team arrived at Ye Jun's home and knocked on the door. Ye Jun opened the door and showed the cultivator where to set up the defensive array for her 2 spiritual fields. The cultivator completed the task in just 15 minutes before moving on to other spiritual plant cultivators' homes to continue his work. Afterward, Ye Jun used a basic spiritual plant nourishment technique, infusing her crops with spiritual energy to enhance their growth. Once her gardening tasks were complete, she returned to the kitchen to cook spiritual porridge for lunch. Time passed slowly in a joyful and peaceful routine. Chapter 24. The last day of the second quarter arrived, and Ye Jun surveyed her garden, marveling at the perfectly matured spiritual herbs. Joy filled her heart as she reflected on the fruits of her labor over the past few months. Little Jun stood nearby, watching as Ye Jun used her earth control technique to gently separate soil from the roots of the white sofware japonica and vines herbs. Carefully, Ye Jun placed a few of the herbs into wooden containers, selecting 2 from each type. These 4 herbs would be sold to the herbal market, while the rest would be sold for the system. Noticing Jun still standing there, Ye Jun waved her hand and said, "Go back inside and continue your studies. There's nothing here that requires your help." Jun nodded obediently and ran back into the house. However, instead of sitting at the study table, he pulled out his toys and began playing on the bed. Glancing into the room, Ye Jun saw him playing but said nothing. She returned her focus to her spiritual field. Standing amidst the herbs, she called out, "System, appear." The system materialized, and Ye Jun placed all the remaining white sofware japonica and vines herbs into the system's tray. The dozens of herbs shrank, fitting neatly into the tray. The sell button lit up and Ye Jun pressed it. In an instant, the herbs vanished. Moments later, various items appeared in the system tray. Inspecting the rewards, Ye Jun found a significant number of low-grade spirit stones. She carefully stored them in her pouch before examining the other items. Among them was an unusual object that resembled a formation plate. Picking it up, she saw it labeled as a Level 1 illusion formation plate. Squinting at the tiny text on the label, she read the description. Level 1 illusion formation plate conceals items within the formation. Effective against cultivators below the mid-foundation establishment stage. Realizing its utility, Ye Jun felt a surge of excitement. She had never purchased a formation plate before, only rented defensive arrays, so she had no idea about its market value. She resolved to research it further when time allowed. She continued examining the items and found another new talisman. Upon closer inspection, she realized it was a Level 1 plant talisman. Checking the remaining items, Ye Jun discovered almost 3 kilograms of Level 1 ore and a golden-colored chunk labeled golden ore, a rare material used for crafting Level 1 alchemical furnaces. Satisfied with her rewards, Ye Jun stored everything in her storage pouch. Since she wasn't a formation master, array master, she didn't know how to configure the formation diagram herself. She decided to visit the formation market for professional help. Ye Jun walked into the room to find little Jun still playing with his toys. She softly asked, "Do you want to go outside with me?" Jun paused his play and nodded eagerly. At over 3 years old, he was robust and energetic, always excited about outings. For Ye Jun, these trips were opportunities for him to learn new things beyond the confines of books. The journey to the formation market took about 40 minutes, a manageable distance from the herbal market. Upon arrival, Ye Jun called for a staff member in a low voice and requested assistance in setting up a formation for her small courtyard. The attendant asked, "What kind of formation would you like to install this time? Should I explain some of the ones we offer?" Instead of answering, Ye Jun took out her formation plate and handed it over. The attendant inspected it briefly and quickly identified it. He then provided her with a quote. "This is a basic illusion formation. The installation cost will be 40 low-grade spirit stones." Ye Jun was stunned. In the past, her family of 3 couldn't save 20 low-grade spirit stones even after a year of frugal living. Now, the cost of installing even a basic formation was double that amount, not to mention the cost of purchasing the formation plate. She hesitantly asked if there could be any discount, but the attendant politely declined, smiling. Left with no choice, Ye Jun reluctantly handed over 40 spirit stones, provided her address, and was told when the technician would come to install the formation. Curious, Ye Jun asked the attendant to introduce her to some other types of formations. The attendant enthusiastically began explaining, "This is a defensive formation. Over here, we have an offensive formation." Ye Jun carefully examined the descriptions next to the formations, squinting at the fine print detailing their features and prices. Her heart trembled as she silently exclaimed, "Good heavens, how expensive!" Little Junso stood beside her, quietly listening as the attendant introduced various formations. Ye Jun's thoughts churned with unease as she calculated the costs. However, she remained silent, letting the attendant continue his detailed presentation. After a few moments, Ye Jun smiled and said, "All right, I've knew about many types of formations in your store. Thank you, fellow Taoist, for such a detailed introduction. If I need anything, I'll reach out again." The attendant, still cheerful, bid her farewell as another customer entered. He quickly turned his attention to the new guest, resuming his busy work. As Ye Jun led Junso out of the store, she spoke to him. "I think we were well off among the rogue cultivators. But now that I've truly looked into the prices of these things, I realize I'm just a frog at the bottom of a well, knowing nothing of the vast world above." She sighed. "I thought everything here is expensive, but I never imagined it would be this expensive. A single level 1 formation plate costs as much as the small courtyard we live in." Junso, holding her hand, asked curiously, "Is it really that expensive, Dad?" Ye Jun nodded, replying, "Very expensive. But at least in this time it can be considered that our family has become rich." Junso listened attentively, but didn't quite understand what she meant. Ye Jun smiled and continued walking with Junso to a nearby grain store. She purchased a 20-kilogram sack of spiritual grain, then led him to the bustling market of rogue cultivators. By now, it was nearing noon, and the sun shone brightly overhead. At a stall, Ye Jun pointed to some cleaned cuts of spiritual poultry meat and asked, "How much is this?" The vendor replied, "This is spiritual poultry meat from a chicken species. It's 2 low-grade spirit stones and 70 fragments per kilogram." Ye Jun skillfully bargained, managing to get a discount of 5 fragments. She purchased 2 poultry, each weighing 4 kilograms, and paid the vendor before storing the poultry in her storage pouch. Standing nearby, Junso watched intently, learning how Ye Jun negotiated prices with the vendor. The pair walked straight home after finishing their errands. Upon entering, Ye Jun unlocked the door and stepped inside. As usual, Junso dashed into the house to pour himself some water. Holding the cup, he turned to Ye Jun and asked, "Dad, would you like some water too?" As usual, Ye Jun declined the offer. She closed the door, then headed into the kitchen. From one of the spiritual poultry, she cut off 2 plump drumsticks and carefully cleaned them. Next, she scooped a bowl of spiritual grain, poured it into a pot, and began cooking it along with the 2 drumsticks. After 30 minutes, She ladled the porridge into 2 large bowls, placing them on the table. Ye Jun called out to Jun-so, "Come to eat." This was the first time Jun-so had ever tasted spiritual poultry meat. The two sat down and ate with great enjoyment. Jun-so exclaimed, "The drumstick is really delicious, Dad. We should eat these more often." Ye Jun nodded in agreement, chewing diligently on the tender, juicy meat from the plump drumstick. Chapter 25. Their lunch concluded. Both Ye Jun and Jun-so brushed their teeth thoroughly. Since Jun-so was already over 3 years old, she doesn't know if he has spiritual roots or not. She wrote down the basic cultivation technique for spiritual farmer and encouraged Jun-so to study it. Following the foundational manual's instructions, she urged him to give it a try. If Jun-so had spiritual roots, he would eventually succeed in cultivating the basics, starting with guiding spiritual energy into his body and then directing it to his dantian. Jun-so nodded earnestly, sitting down to focus on the text. He became deeply engrossed in learning, continuing until evening. Meanwhile, Ye Jun sat cross-legged on her bed, meditating to absorb spiritual energy. Yet, despite her efforts, she hadn't gained any holy cultivation auras from the previous quarter's harvest season, leaving her cultivation progress stagnant. As the sky darkened, Ye Jun opened her eyes, ending her meditation. She stepped into the kitchen to reheat the leftover congee from lunch, serving 2 bowls on the table. "How far have you gotten in your studies? Are there any parts you don't understand?" she asked. Jun-so. "I've been learning," Jun-so replied. "So far, there's nothing I don't understand." "That's great," Ye Jun said. "Put it aside for now. You can continue tomorrow. Let's eat first." The two shared their meal, brushed their teeth again, and prepared for bed. Since Ye Jun was a cultivator, she didn't need sleep. She spent the night in meditation, continuously absorbing spiritual energy until dawn. As the first light of morning appeared, Ye Jun ended her cultivation. She stepped outside to tend to her spiritual herb garden. She fertilized, watered, and sowed seeds of white Sephora japonica spiritual herbs and spiritual vines, along with the remaining spiritual seed grains. Working tirelessly until almost noon, Ye Jun finally took a break, preparing and serving another meal for herself and Jun-so. After eating, they returned to their respective tasks. On the second day of learning the basics of the spiritual farm's technique, Jun-so successfully initiated spiritual energy induction, reaching the preliminary stage of Qi refining level 1. At this point, he was only at Qi induction level 0.1, meaning the process of drawing spiritual energy into his body was slow and would require time. Only after absorbing sufficient energy would he progress to Qi refining level 1. While meditating on her bed, Ye Jun heard a knock at the door. She knew it was the array master who had come to help set up the formation. Pausing her cultivation, she stood up, walked over, and opened the door to greet him. Ye Jun invited the cultivator inside and showed him where to set up the formation base. She took out the formation device and handed it to him. The array master worked swiftly, setting up the mystical concealment formation. The house, along with the 2 of spiritual fields, was now hidden within the formation, making it impossible for anyone to investigate the inside. Ye Jun thanked the array master and, as he was leaving, she slipped a few fragmented spirit stones into his hand. Once outside, he opened his palm to see the small bonus. He pouted but said nothing before leaving. That evening, after dinner, Ye Jun shared some casual stories about her childhood in South Korea, reminiscing about how difficult her school days had been. Listening intently, Jun-so suddenly said, "Dad, I've already reached the stage of spiritual energy induction and am about to enter early stage Qi refining level 1. Ye Jun was startled by the speed at which her son was absorbing spiritual energy. Smiling warmly, she praised and encouraged him to keep up the hard work. Not long after, Jun-so lay down and drifted off to sleep. Beside him, Ye Jun sat cross-legged, eyes closed, quietly meditating as she absorbed spiritual energy and guided it into her dantian. Despite her ambitions for her son, Ye Jun didn't want him to spend his entire childhood immersed in cultivation like she had. She hoped he could have a happy and carefree childhood, delaying the rigors of daily cultivation until he was older. Ye Jun understood that if everything went well, both she and Jun So would remain rogue cultivators. They would spend centuries cultivating, a long and arduous journey. If they were fortunate enough to reach higher stages, they might live even longer, but the time spent in cultivation would stretch on endlessly. The process of cultivation was inherently monotonous. Devoting countless years to cultivation alone was bound to be tedious, yet necessary. Ye Jun, still only 19 years old, had not cultivated long enough to understand the weight of this monotony. Time passed slowly, and the end of the third quarter drew near. The spiritual grain in Ye Jun's fields had ripened, the golden grains hanging heavily, nearly touching the ground. Their faint aroma filled the garden, mingling with the scents of other spiritual plants in the area. Similar scenes unfolded in the fields of other spiritual farmer, as the entire region brimmed with the fragrance of spiritual grain and herbs. Ye Jun worked quickly, harvesting all the heavy spiritual grains. After gathering and bagging them, she found she had nearly 20 kilograms of spiritual grain. This time, Ye Jun decided to sell the newly harvested spiritual grain to the system since she still had a few bags of store-bought grain left untouched. She summoned the system, placed the bag of spiritual grain inside, and pressed the sell button. The grain vanished instantly, and the system returned some items in exchange. Ye Jun was delighted when she saw the halo light of cultivation energy among the rewards. She eagerly absorbed 2 halo orbs. 1 year of cultivation energy was absorbed. 3 more years of cultivation energy followed. A total of 4 years' worth of cultivation was gained, equivalent to 4 arduous years of cultivations. She also picked up several fragmented spirit stones and stored them in her spatial pouch. Among the rewards was a small stone that wasn't a regular mineral. Upon checking its description, Ye Jun found it to be a formation crafting material. She tucked it into her pouch, satisfied with the results of the sale. Next, Ye Jun controlled the soil to uproot all her white Sephora japonica spiritual herbs and vines. She placed them carefully into a wooden box, sealed it, and stored it in her spatial pouch. She then loaded the harvested spiritual herbs into the system tray and hit sell once more. This time, the system returned, another halo light of cultivation energy, which Ye Jun quickly absorbed, bringing her cultivation progress to 8 years. 1 medium-grade spirit stone. 2 grade, 1 plant talismans. 1 grade, 1 water explosion pearl. 5 pieces of plant elemental minerals. 1 grade, 1 fire talisman. Her spatial pouch, now expanded to 10 cubic meters, comfortably held all these items. Despite her growing inventory, most of the pouch's space remained unused. From the past few harvests, Ye Jun had accumulated 2 medium-grade spirit stones and countless low-grade ones, making her wealthier than before. Although Ye Jun was skilled in spear techniques, she still didn't own a proper weapon. Her spatial pouch contained a immortal sword, but it wasn't suitable for her since her cultivation method emphasized spear combat. She decided to visit the blacksmith tomorrow to purchase a long spear. The wooden staff she had been using for practice was now too light and no longer matched her advanced skills. A proper weapon was overdue. As the third quarter's harvest season ended, cold air began to set in. On the bamboo bed, little Jun So sat quietly in meditation. At almost 4 years old, he had already reached Qi refining level 1, slowly absorbing the spiritual energy of heaven and earth. His progress at such a young age marked him as having exceptional talent in the path of cultivation. Winter in the North Continent is also the time when the immortal sects hold their grand event to test the spiritual roots, where cultivators can come to participate in the tests. After completing the tests in the sects regions, some cultivators will move to the mortal world to find and recruit individuals with roots potential. This period is the grand event, when the sects are bustling, and it's also when opportunities arise for infiltrators to take action. The dark, evil cultivators have been waiting for this chance to strike. They capture cultivators from Tanban sect and replace them to perform regular tasks and assist with the grand event. They will approach higher-ranking cultivators, deceive them, and kidnap them, impersonating them afterward. Everything goes smoothly without any flaws, and no one suspects a thing. The event to test the spiritual roots continues, bustling as usual. The cultivators from Tanban sect who are kidnapped are mostly outer disciples, not yet inner disciples. These dark, evil cultivators have only just infiltrated Tanban sect, and it will take more time to approach the inner disciples. This is part of a long-term plan they have been preparing. After the batch of pills, Consolidating Essence Pill, was successfully refined in the Western continent, many demonic cultivators broke through to higher realms, greatly enhancing their combat strength. They have now begun returning to the Ha family area, hiding within the family. The business operations of the Ha clan continue as normal, with no noticeable changes. No one suspects anything unusual. Life in the Ha family clan region remains peaceful and busy. As winter arrived, it marked the time for Tanban sect's grand event to test spiritual roots, which is free of charge. Ye Jun knew about it, but she did not bring her son Jun So to undergo the test. She knew that her son had already reached Qi level 1. He was certainly born with spiritual roots, so there was no need to waste time on the test. Ye Jun also didn't want him to become an outer disciple of Tanban sect, as she didn't want him to leave her side while he was still so small. Chapter 26. The snow began to fall, with tiny snowflakes drifting down. Ye Jun and Jun So both wore warm clothes as they stepped outside. This time, she took Jun So for a walk around the area before heading straight to the grocery and herb market to sell her spirit herbs. She also took the opportunity to stop by the blacksmith shop to learn about the types of weapons she planned to use in the future. Although little Jun So had already become a cultivator, Ye Jun still used her spiritual power to shield him, protecting him from the cold air that could harm his body. Jun So was very happy as they walked together, reaching out his hands to catch the tiny snowflakes falling from the sky. After selling everything that needed to be sold, Ye Jun took Jun So to the blacksmith shop. They both entered, and she asked the shopkeeper about the first level immortal spear. Book 2 is end here. Love this audiobook. Please donate for author.